Hi, so this week I want to look in detail at two things. Firstly, how the midterm elections are being influenced, and secondly, a series of stories about self enrichment and corruption. So let's get into it. So, elections first. The midterms are in November, and a lot of what has happened over the last week is about Republicans trying to counteract their deep unpopularity and try to save their majority in Congress. The Florida Supreme Court has allowed new congressional districts, which were drawn by Republicans, to be used in the midterms. So, this is part of a national redistricting effort that Trump has personally encouraged, effectively asking the Republican led states to redraw their maps to create more Republican safe seats. The new Florida map could give Republicans up to 4 extra seats. The map was originally passed by the Florida state legislature on the same day as the US Supreme Court gutted a key part of the Voting Rights Act. And then the Florida Supreme Court, which now has a 6-1 conservative majority after DeSantis, the Florida governor, remade the bench, declined to step in. So that effectively locks that map in place for November. Overall, the kind of gerrymandering has washed out at about +8, +10 Republican seats in the midterms. Next, the US Postal Service. So the Postal Service has proposed a new rule that would let it refuse to deliver mail ballots in states that don't hand over their voter rolls to the federal government. So this all kind of goes back to an executive order that Trump signed in March, where under that, states would have to submit lists of every voter due to receive a mail ballot. And what he wanted was for the Postal Service to then refuse to deliver ballots to anyone not on a pre-approved list. Now, voting rights groups, including the NAACP, say that this could disenfranchise millions of legal voters and that screening ballots in this way would be an unprecedented and probably unconstitutional involvement of the federal government in state elections. It's also just worth saying that the administration has so far lost all of its court fights trying to get states to hand over their voter rolls. So this looks like another way that they're trying to get to that same goal and basically disenfranchise voters. And this rule, if it is implemented, would apply to the November midterms. Thirdly, we're looking at California. So after California's primary on the 2nd of June, Trump claimed, without evidence, that Democrats were trying to steal elections in the state. When he was asked on NBC's Meet the Press what evidence he had, he said, "All I have to do is look." So that's the interview that he later walked out of, which I covered in last week's video. But following his claims, then a Trump-appointed federal prosecutor in LA announced that he'd opened multiple election fraud investigations following the primary. Now, California's own Attorney General has pointed out that every count, recount, and audit has shown no widespread fraud. And finally, Ohio. The FBI raided the Cleveland office of the Ohio Organizing Collaborative. So that is a grassroots group that does voter registration work, particularly among young voters and voters of colour. And according to a board member of the Ohio Organizing Collaborative, more than 100 agents were involved in that raid. And they searched the office, seized phones and laptops, turned up at the homes of people connected to the group, and questioned them, in some cases carrying subpoenas. The group said it was told the questions related to voter fraud. Now, the congresswoman in the area called it an unprecedented attack on democracy in an attempt to intimidate people doing voter registration ahead of the midterms. This kind of move follows a similar FBI raid on the Fulton County Election Center in Georgia, which was back in January this year. So, if you put those together over the last week, you get a fairly clear picture of the range of ways in that Republicans are trying to win the November midterms without actually becoming any more popular. Moving on to corruption, and really a series of stories about people enriching themselves, kind of bending the rules. So let's start with something called Kratom. So Kratom is a herbal supplement. It's sold in shops and petrol stations across America. And federal health officials have linked it to liver toxicity, seizures, and even thousands of deaths. So last year, Homeland Security Secretary Mark Wayne Mullen, who was then just a senator, campaigned publicly alongside Health Secretary RFK Jr. for a crackdown on a particularly dangerous synthetic version of Kratom called 7-OH, which sounds fine, but Mullen holds an investment worth up to $1 million in a company that sells traditional Kratom products, so products that compete directly with the synthetic version he was seeking to ban. So last week, a New York Times investigation reported that Mullen played a key role in that influence campaign. So he effectively courted RFK Jr. and JD Vance to run this campaign, which could financially benefit him. Next, and staying on the theme of self-enrichment, but this time it's Trump's enrichment. So over the weekend, the White House hosted a UFC mixed martial arts event on the South Lawn, all around kind of Trump's 80th birthday and the 250th anniversary of the US. So ignoring the spectacle of holding a cage fight on the lawn of the White House, let's look at how it was paid. So the winning fighters were paid in part in a cryptocurrency called USD1, which is issued by World Liberty Financial, which is the Trump family's own crypto company. There was also a $1 million bonus pool from crypto.com paid in a different token. So a former chief White House ethics lawyer said that for almost any other federal official, profiting from a government event would probably be a felony. But there is a specific exemption in the law for the president. But Trump has already made more than $57 million from World Liberty's tokens, according to his own financial disclosure. So even though this is probably legal, it was in effect a government event on government property that promoted the president's personal crypto business. Then let's think about pardon. So this is also about the rule of law. So a Reuters investigation found that 96% of the pardon decisions Trump has made this term did not meet long-standing Justice Department guidelines. So those guidelines are things like you shouldn't pardon anyone until at least 5 years after their conviction. The people being pardoned need to show remorse and so on. So instead of going through the kind of formal Justice Department process, pardons now run through an informal network of influencers and advocates who appeal just directly to Trump. So for example, Trump pardoned Trevor Milton, who is an electric vehicle entrepreneur convicted of defrauding investors of hundreds of millions of dollars. Trump actually said that he credited that pardon to Bobby, i.e. RFK Jr., for putting in a good word. Milton has also donated generously to many Trump-aligned causes. So, critics have described this as kind of a pay-to-play system where effectively, if you can get access to Trump's inner circle, you're much more likely to get a pardon. So it's about the pardon power being used to reward political loyalty and connection and has nothing to do with justice. And then finally, I just want to end on two stories that are about loyalty to Trump as a cult leader. So the first is that Trump and his allies are pushing lawmakers in Congress to pass a resolution to void his two first-term impeachments. So he was impeached twice in his first term, once for abuse of power over Ukraine, and once for inciting the January 6th insurrection. But the issue is that the resolution would be purely symbolic because the Constitution has no mechanism for undoing an impeachment, so you can't really erase them. Now, House Speaker Mike Johnson supports the effort. There's a resolution that already has 23 Republican co-sponsors. So this is about Congress people spending real political effort and time on a gesture that changes nothing in law and is only there to please Trump and try and rewrite the record and rewrite history. Then secondly, so back in December, the board of the Kennedy Arts Center added Trump's name to the building. And this is a board that was handpicked by Trump, and he is the chair. A federal judge ruled that this was illegal because only Congress can rename the Kennedy Center. Now, the board fought that ruling. It tried to seek a stay from two courts. It filed an emergency appeal. It asked for extensions and so on. But it did finally remove the lettering in the early hours after a court deadline. But since they've removed it a couple of days ago, the facade of the building is still completely covered with a tarp. Now, the centre says it's for maintenance work. People are kind of wondering whether they just don't want to show it without Trump's name. But the bigger picture is that you've got this board that Trump appointed going to considerable lengths through the courts to keep his name on a building that it really didn't have the authority to rename in the first place. So that's it for this week. There's been plenty happening elsewhere too on immigration, civil rights, science. It's all there on the trumpactiontracker.info, and I will see you in a week or two.